Anyway, good evening and welcome to the fifth in our series of webinars. We have quite a few more stacked up as well. For those of you that don't know me or can't remember me, I'm William Stockdale, Chair of Thornton-le-Street History Group. We're delighted again to welcome tonight's speaker, Professor Chris Gerrad from the University of Durham. And Chris is going to be talking to us about Lost Lives, New Worlds, the story of the Scottish soldiers buried at Durham that were captured at the 1650 Battle of Dunbar. Now, if you do have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box. Don't use chat, just use the Q&A box. Okay, thank you. Right, I'll now hand you over to Chris.
Thank you, Bill. That's very kind. I'm just going to share my screen with you and bring up the first slide. So the project that I'm going to be talking to you about this evening is one that frankly changed my life completely. I've been an archaeologist for over 35 years, and I've never come across a project quite like this, one that had such a big impact both on my colleagues on the Durham Archaeology Department and on people with interests in this project all over the world. It's not so much a whodunit as a what-done-it that I'm going to be talking about this evening. And it begins back in November 2013. I was the head of the Department of Archaeology at that time. And in late November, I knew that the archaeological unit, we have a small commercial unit in Durham, which works for commercial developers and highways. They were digging a hole up near the cathedral in preparation for the groundworks for a new cafe, which was being built by the university. And the work had been going on for quite some time. I'd heard nothing about it. And on one rainy afternoon, late on, about 4:30, it was going dark and my phone rang and a voice on the other end said, "I think you better get up here. We found something." And so I put my coat on and tromped through the rain and went up to the centre of Durham, Palace Green. And I'm sure many of you know Palace Green, framed by the cathedral and the castle. So just to take you through the sort of geography of this site, just so that you're clear about where the find was made, because this is important in telling the overall story. On the north side of Palace Green, we have Durham Castle, which is now the University College. On the south side, we have the graveyard of Durham Cathedral. And within the graveyard, we have this building, which is the old grammar school. It's now the music school of Durham University, but it's been a grammar school since the 16th century. And you'll notice that it's kind of within the churchyard of the cathedral, and that's important. On the west side of Palace Green are what we call Palace Green Library, which is actually a whole sequence of different buildings of different date, of which the earliest is 17th century, late 17th century. And within those buildings, there are a number of brick buildings, which when you wander through Palace Green Library, and some of you may have done that to go to the new cafe there or to go to exhibitions, you don't really appreciate that you're inside these older brick buildings, but they're there, this S-shaped arrangement of what were the bishop's stables, the stables associated with the castle further to the north. And those brick buildings are maybe late 17th century or possibly 18th century in date. The area of the cathedral and the land which is to do with the Durham Castle and the bishop's residence is separated by a narrow alleyway, and this is known as Windy Gap. And Windy Gap provides you with access down towards the riverbank and down towards Framwell Gate Bridge. So the area that we're talking about is this distinctly unpromising excavation site. This is as it was in September 2013, before the excavation started. You can see it's just a jumble of vegetation and fire exits and stairwells between sets of existing buildings. On the right there, you can see one of the brick bishop's stables, which is now repurposed as an education space. And it was here that the university were determined to build a new cafe. So the idea was to strip out all of these fire exits and put something new in their place, which would make better use of the space. The site, because it lies within the World Heritage Site, and because it's close to the cathedral and the castle, meant that it was necessary to have an archaeologist on site while the groundworks were underway. So there was one member of staff here just observing what was going on. And when I arrived, the site looked like this. This slide is taken the next morning. And you can see the mini digger here. It had to be a mini digger because there wasn't much space in there. And you can see it's digging out these dark earths that you can see in the background in the section. And if I draw in one of the lines here of the stratigraphy, you can see to the left and upwards of that yellow line, these dark earths, which are part of a large 18th century pit. It was full of clay pipes and pottery of that kind of date. Nothing of tremendous archaeological interest. But below that yellow line and to the right, where you can see the ground is raised up on these mounds of yellowy tan-coloured clay, there were a large number of human skeletons. This is what the skeletons look like. You can see immediately that they are not buried as one would expect for a Christian cemetery. And I recall, when I think back on that evening, you know, what did we say to each other? What did we think we were looking at? And it was certainly the preferred opinion that these were probably prehistoric burials, because there were no artifacts to be seen associated with them. And we had, of course, no idea at all as to what kind of date they might be. And in fact, as the excavation proceeded over the next 3 to 4 weeks, it didn't really become any clearer as we got deeper. What we found was that we were excavating a couple of mass burials. And this graphic here gives you an idea of the way in which the individual bodies were overlain one on top of another. You can see that they're not in individual graves. There are no artifacts, no buckles, no buttons, no ceramics, absolutely nothing of that kind. And some of the individuals have their arms by their sides. The majority of them have their hands almost thrown up in front of their face, if you like. They're in a kind of jumbled, chaotic position. And if you look at the north side in the top right-hand side of my slide here, you can see that they're buried, in this case, roughly north-south. And as you know, most Christian burials are east-west. And it was this that kind of led us towards the idea that they might be rather early. We also found that the graves and bodies went underneath the adjacent buildings. And of course, that gave us our first clue as to date. The brick buildings, the stables I pointed out to you earlier, certainly had graves disappearing underneath them. And knowing that those buildings could be dated to the late 17th or 18th century meant that we must be dealing with something old. But of course, we had still no idea as to a precise date. And people sometimes ask me in lectures what I think I was looking at that evening. And I've given you an example here in the bottom part of the slide of a grave which was found in Germany, a 17th century grave, very controversially excavated. But you can see it's a jumble of bodies set out in a mass burial pit. And I think those of you that can think back to 20th century wartime atrocities will recall of a number of episodes of genocide in which people have been buried in trenches. And these burials associated with what we call conflict archaeology are of more or less similar dimensions. They're the dimensions which would allow you to throw a body into a trench and to pile bodies one on top of another without getting down into the trench yourself. So they tend to be a fairly standard width of the kind that we can see here. And they tend to be a fairly standardized depth. And that's really what we were looking at in this Durham examples. This particular German example, incidentally, was controversial because it was lifted as a single block of earth, absolutely massive operation, digging underneath it using engineering techniques to put all of the archaeology onto a gigantic steel raft and then lift it using huge cranes, and then depositing all of it intact into a laboratory where it could be dissected over several months. But we didn't have that opportunity. There were other timescales to be dealt with on site, and the weather wasn't kind to us. And we couldn't have done this kind of operation, although it was considered at the time. Okay, just a refresher about where we are. This is Palace Green again. You can see the red circle, that's where the burials were. You can see the purple arrow here, that's Windy Gap again. And the green dotted line is the line of the medieval town wall in Durham. So you can see that the burials are positioned inside of Durham. Another few meters to the left, and we would have been outside the town walls, but we're just inside the town walls. So if I just take away some of the buildings which we know weren't there in only the recent past, it rather helps to reconstruct the general environment. If we take out the Pace building, which was constructed in the 1950s, we don't need to think too much about that. If we take out the 19th century university library, then we can put that back to green space. If we take out the Bishop's Stables, you can see we're opening up quite a big green area here. If we take out Cussons Library, built in the 1660s, and if we replace the music school as it is today with the outline of what it was the grammar school in the blue block here, you can see a very different configuration of buildings. And what becomes clear from this is that these burials are at the bottom of the garden. They are right as far away as you can get on Bishop's property at the bottom of the garden, away from the castle. The other interesting thing, I think, is that they are out of sight and out of mind. So it wouldn't be possible to see anybody digging graves there because the site is hidden by this building here, which was there in the 16th and 17th centuries. And this is the diocesan court, the registry as it later became, and is now part of the Durham Music School. So you can see that nobody could have seen in as you were walking down that alleyway with its high walls on either side. You only would have known what was going on if you were within the Bishop's Garden. And then finally, I'll just put the moat back here, and you can see that this green area, which may well have had wooden buildings on it, or perhaps less substantial buildings that we don't yet know about, you can clearly see that it's in this tongue of land heading southwards towards the cathedral. Now, what we did then was we did some geophysics, and I know that you're familiar with this technique, but the geophysics enabled us to say that there were no further burial pits either associated with the Pace building or under Palace Green. There is an archaeology of Palace Green actually, but it doesn't include burial pits. We also did work further to the north in and around that moat, and found that there was nothing like burial pits to be found there either. So this came as, well, how can I put this, rather disappointing news to the university, who of course are the owners of this land, and also the developer, I might say, in this case, since they were footing the bill for the new cafe, because the implication is that there are more bodies, there are more mass graves. We know that they are disappearing under those brick stables that I showed you earlier, and that means there are more bodies, and they must be underneath the university library there. And of course that's not something that any developer wants to hear, and it's something that of course came back a little bit later on in our story when it came to questions about what we might want to do next. So that's the general history of the excavation. Now, of course, we are fortunate in Durham because we have, you know, some world-leading laboratories, fantastic facilities for study of osteology and human skeletal analysis. And that work was undertaken by Anwen Caffel through that winter of 2013-2014. So the first thing that Anwen came to me to talk about, as I recall, late one evening. I have a tendency to work quite late, and I think it was probably about 9 o'clock at night in an empty department, sort of January time, perhaps this time of year. Anwen came and knocked on my door, and she said, you know, there's something quite unusual here. These are all people who appear to be quite young, and many of them are only adolescents. There are a few older people, but they're quite tight in terms of their age distribution, between about 13 and 25. And then again, a few days later, I remember having a cup of coffee with her, and she said, you know, and I'm now sure that they're all men. There are no women there. We did have a few that were unsexed, but we've now been able to sex those using DNA. They are, in fact, entirely a male group. So this gave us our first real indication as to the sort of things that they couldn't be. For example, if it had been about plague, and you do get mass burials associated with plague, we would expect a more representative sample of the population. We'd expect to see some older people, we would expect to see children, and we saw nothing like that. It's really a very tightly defined segment of the population here. And that profile is very typical, of course, of military contexts. We still had no idea of date, but we began to think then along different lines. The other things that Anwen was able to look at in great detail was the health of the individuals who had been buried there. She found that many of them suffered from enamel hyperplasia, and enamel hyperplasia is a condition which is caused by, well, it results in this kind of pitting you can see here, with these red arrows, these kinds of lines on the teeth. And really this is caused by your body when it stops growing. Usually you're living in starvation conditions. So your body concentrates on keeping your vital organs alive and stops growing if you're of an age in which you're still growing. And the interesting thing about the slide on the right here, you can see a tooth, a molar here, which has pitting in the upper surface. Now this means that this child, when this molar had come through, probably it's about 3 to 6 months of age, was already starving. So as likely as not, the mother is in poor condition as well. So we're talking about a population here which looks to be in conditions of malnutrition. And that was then confirmed by other things that Anwen began to find, evidence of sinusitis. I'm sure you all know what that is. You know, when you get a bad cold, usually or often caused by poor air quality. And we also found evidence for scurvy and also for rickets, which was present in about a third of the individuals. You can see the kind of graying of the bone on these two left-hand slides, which is very typical of scurvy conditions. Scurvy all over the body, I should say. What we didn't find very much of was evidence of military activity, which led to further kind of conversations in the corridor over that winter. There was a broken rib, you can see it top left. There was a broken finger, but you know, this is nothing more than you would expect in everyday life, even in post-medieval Durham or medieval Durham, nothing unusual about it. I got momentarily excited by what looked to me almost certainly, I thought, to be some sort of musket ball damage in the top of this person's cranium. You can see bottom right. That turns out to be a perfectly benign cyst and nothing to do at all with any kind of traumatic injury. In the top right, you can see a single blade mark across the top of the head. And again, we examined this with a scanning electron microscope with great interest, wondered whether it might be, for example, a sword blade or something of that kind. But in fact, the indentation there is very blunt, and it fits more closely with the profile of a spade. So the implication of this is that these individuals have been found before, that somebody at some time in the past has come down digging foundations on top of these bodies and clouted this person's cranium with the top of their spade. We don't know when this happened. It might have been as recently as the 1960s, when the fire escape went in. It could have been as early as the 18th century or late 17th century, when that brick building, the stables, was first constructed. But either way, there's always been a legend in Durham that there were the remains of Scottish soldiers from the Battle of Dunbar in 1650. And the profile began to fit that kind of scenario, that somebody had found these bodies before, and this kind of myth had become an urban myth over the following centuries. But the mystery here for us was that we didn't really have any evidence of conflict on the bones, no evidence of trauma, nothing in the way of musket ball injuries. And so there were debates really between us about what was going on. Everything looked like a military context, but it just didn't quite fit. And of course, we still didn't have a date. We also found, looking at the dental arrangements of the mandibles, that some very significant results, one of which was that the teeth on a number of individuals had kind of opened and splayed out at the front in this kind of crescent shape that you see bottom right. Now, if any of you know anybody that smokes a pipe, you will know that it's possible for the teeth to shift around in the mouth a little bit to accommodate the pipe stem. And that's what we're looking at here, pipe smoking. Pipe smoking means tobacco, and that of course gives us a date. That tells us that if we know that the first tobacco from the Virginia plantations is coming in to the UK in about 1590, but not really available to the ordinary man until perhaps 1615, 1620, that means that this individual must have been smoking after that date. So it begins to tie us down somewhere in the 17th century. There were some examples of abscesses in the top left here, rather nasty dental conditions that we don't need to talk about, not the sort of thing you want to have. Top right, you can see an incisor here with a little V-shaped notch in it, which is very interesting, with several examples of this. Again, if any of you sew, you might be prone to holding pins between your teeth, and examinations of people's teeth are involved in textiles and sewing does show that you will have a preferred way of holding your pins and your needles between your teeth. And that's perhaps what we're looking at here. Somebody who was involved in some way with textiles, could be a fisherman mending their nets, or it could be somebody who has a profession in around making linen and cloth. So this gives you an insight really into my view as to what those people would have looked like smoking. These rather unlikely lads at the top here with their clay pipes, and there are those clay pipes in the bottom left. Of course, these are clay pipes, so they are quite abrasive, and that does go some way to explaining the condition that we see on the teeth. The other thing that we found on several of the long bones, which we were able to observe under low raking light and outlined in red for you here, are these striations, these marks, parallel marks running across the bone. And this, I'm afraid, is vermin. This is rat infestation, and they've been able to chew through the flesh and down onto the bone. Whether or not this happens before the bodies go into the ground or once the bodies are in the ground, we can't say. But certainly there were rats around at some point in this rather gruesome process of creating these mass burials. So we then turn to our friends in skeleton science, really to answer two questions. We wanted to know how old these burials were, how old these individuals were, and we also wanted to know who they were, where'd they come from. And these are the kinds of exciting questions that archaeology is now able to answer using science. And the first thing we did was look at the isotopes in the bones. Now, I don't know if you know very much about isotopes, but very briefly, if you don't, we get strontium in our bones from eating vegetables and from eating animals which graze on grass on certain kinds of geology. And since geology varies across the British Isles, depending on the amount of strontium in your bones, assuming that you're eating local beasts of one sort or another, your strontium values are going to go up and down depending on the local geology. So it provides us, if you like, with kind of one crosshair as to where you were born and brought up and how you've moved across the country during your lifetime. The other axis of this graph is oxygen, which we get in our bones from drinking water. Now, if you buy your water from the supermarket in bottles, it's not going to be very helpful for archaeologists in the future. But in the past, people drank local water from local wells, of course, and that means that it gives us another means of pinpointing where people might have been from. So this is a distribution plot. I won't go into it in very much detail. Everybody within the blue box there, so that's this box here, everybody within that box there could be Scottish. Everybody within the inner red box could also be from Northern England, either Scotland or Northern England. So what that indicates is that this is a northern population. Most of the people lie within the blue box. They're probably Scottish, but there are three individuals who are outliers to the left. These individuals here, they cannot be Northern English, they cannot be Scottish, they can't be from the UK at all, in fact. They must be from much further east, probably from the Baltic, and likely as not from what we would now think of as North Germany, possibly southern Sweden. So we have three individuals who don't fit the rest of the pattern. As far as the dating's concerned, well, we were able to say that they must be dated after about 1615, because that's when we get the evidence for tobacco and pipe smoking. We also know that those brick buildings appear on a map of 1755. The size of the brick, actually, and the way that the buildings are constructed suggests that it's probably a late 17th century building, but it first appears on a map in 1755, so we can be sure of that date. So we're operating in this window here. So what we did was to look at the teeth of individuals and took radiocarbon dates from the teeth, and this enabled us to pinpoint the date of their death very accurately to almost exactly 1650. So we're looking for a context, a military context around 1650, which involved the Scottish. And that brings us very neatly back to this legend of people being buried after the Battle of Dunbar. We were also able to do DNA. DNA survived very well in this case, and that showed us that at least two of the individuals were brothers. And we were able to say something about their diet. These days, we're able to excavate the plaque between your teeth. That's the sort of thing that the dentist takes away when you go to the dentist. You have to stop them doing that because that's ruining archaeological evidence. But if you don't have your teeth cleaned and you don't use a toothbrush, this is what their teeth are going to look like. This kind of slurry of plaque down the back of your teeth where you can't pick away at it. And rather wonderfully, it contains all the evidence of what you've been eating. And for an archaeologist, that's all very exciting because we can take little bits out of that, dissolve it in acid, and identify all the bits. And in this case, we've got oats. We've got, you can see them bottom left here, we've got some brassicas. It's probably cabbage or kale. Lots of sooting. Just remember that sinusitis. There's a lot of bad air being breathed in here. And we're able these days to look at the proteins within, believe it or not, that calculus or plaque. And that tells us something about the oral bacteria inside your mouth. And that tells us that these individuals did not die from influenza. They didn't die from TB. They didn't die from plague. They died from something which doesn't leave a mark on the body. And they certainly didn't die from their wounds. So that left that kind of question open. But what it did do was mean that for every individual, which we gave a skeleton number to, we were able to reconstruct, obviously, their sex, how old they were when they died. That means we can work out when they were born because we know when they died. And then we have a complete biography. We know that this guy was brought up in the central lowlands of Scotland. We know that he moved around. We know he had rickets, multiple stress episodes. We know what he ate. We know he had lower back pain. We know he had a bit of sciatica. We know what was in his mouth, like pneumonia and bronchitis, and so on. So we can end up with an amazing biography with tremendous detail. And that meant that we could then reconstruct, of course, perhaps some sort of facial reconstruction. This was done by John Moore's University at Liverpool, who do a lot of work for kind of CSI, homicide detection work for the police. And they produced this image. I think it's very striking. I asked them how accurate this would be, and I'll tell you what they said. They said, look, you know, we can't know the hair color, we don't know the color of the eyes, but you know, we do know the shape of the face, and it's good enough for if this person's mother walked into the room, then she would recognize her child. It's good enough for that. So I think that's as close as we're going to get to an image of what some of these soldiers looked like. So conclusions, we know they're young, they're male, they're not veterans, mass graves, varied origins, but most of them come from Scotland, mid-17th century, and that gives us this context, historical context of the Battle of Dunbar in 1650. So let's just follow up a little bit on that. I haven't got much time to go into a huge amount of detail here, but we're in the Wars of the Three Kingdoms here, sometimes referred to as the Civil Wars. And we are about a year, a little bit more than a year, after Charles I lost his head. The important thing here, for the purposes of this discussion, is to remember that Charles I was not just the King of England, and it had been the English who cut his head off. He was also the King of Scotland. He wasn't just the King of Scotland. He spoke with a Scottish accent. He was born in Scotland. His father was Scottish. And the Scottish were unhappy about what had happened, about decisions which had been taken without their involvement, amongst a number of other issues which they had cause for complaint against the English. So in the summer of 1650, worried about what the Scottish might be thinking and about whether or not they might be proposing an invasion of northern England, Cromwell took an army, Cromwell top right here, Oliver Cromwell took an army northwards, crossed the Scottish border and effectively invaded Scotland. There was then a kind of cat and mouse, inconclusive skirmishes which took place in and around Edinburgh and Leith until Oliver Cromwell retreated back to Dunbar, which is a port, and in order to offload some of his men who were suffering from dysentery, but also to get new supplies in. And you can see the boats in this drawing, in the bottom of the drawing here, above the words Dunbar, 3rd of September. Meanwhile, the Scottish closed in, much larger numbers, led by David Leslie, a Covenanting army, 22,000 Scottish against 11,000 English. Cromwell, from his letters back to his friends, seems to have thought that very probably his time was up, because the Scottish held the higher ground and were much larger in terms of their overall numbers. In spite of that, the English won a resounding victory. The battle was over within an hour. There was some serious fighting. About 3,000 Scots were killed, but very few English, according to English accounts, and there is no Scottish account of the Battle of Dunbar. You need to bear that in mind. Cromwell suddenly found himself on the battlefield with 10,000 prisoners, unprecedented numbers. He decided that all of those who were old or very young should be allowed to return home. So they left the battlefield, about 5,000 of them, and that left him with about 3,900 men. And he decided that he would march those men south. So they set off from Dunbar. They marched through Berwick upon Tweed, where 30 men at least were shot for not being willing to continue. They weren't fed. They were corralled into the Middle Bailey at Alnwick Castle. They ate raw cabbages in a garden in Morpeth, made themselves sick. People died along the way. People escaped. And some people refer to this as a death march. Certainly we know that by the time this group arrived in Durham, there were probably only about 3,000 of them left, if that. So we're losing about 900 men in the space of 8 days on a march of about 100 miles. Some people were left behind in Newcastle because they were too sick to continue, and it would seem that the men were badly infected with dysentery. The officers, if you're interested in the officers, they were separated out and they found themselves locked up in Tynemouth Castle. But the ordinary soldiers were marched onwards to Durham Cathedral. And so they end up in Durham Cathedral, badly infected with dysentery, and begin to die in large numbers. Durham Cathedral, I mean, it doesn't look exactly as it did in 1650. There are some changes, but broadly speaking, it's this kind of space that the Scottish soldiers occupied. And some of them didn't leave the cathedral for over 18 months. So we do know something about their time in there. In the late 1960s, an American visitor to the cathedral slipped and fell over and broke her hip. And the cathedral were sufficiently concerned about the slippery state of the stones in the cathedral that they commissioned the chemistry department to find out what this rather slimy ooze was, which was coming out of the stones at the east end of the cathedral in and around the choir. And this kind of oily film was analysed and discovered to be nitrates, urine. The chemistry department went back in and plotted out every stone which had this oily film on it and produced a version of this. This is a rather neater version than the one that they have, but more or less it shows the same information. And I think what this is showing is that the Scots used the east end of the church, of the cathedral, as their toilet, and they congregated in the west end. Bear in mind that in a very large service in the cathedral, you get about 1,600 people in there sitting down. There were 3,000 Scots. So they wouldn't have been able to sit down at all. They probably would have had to take it in turns to sleep. But certainly they occupied the west end. And I spent a lot of time in there looking at the stones and the pillars with that in mind. And there are a number of scorch marks on the walls, which are probably the marks of the braziers where they heated themselves, kept themselves warm, which were positioned up against the walls, mainly at that west end of the church. They certainly did some damage in the church as well, it has to be said. Some of the woodwork was probably burnt. And there is some accusation that they got out and escaped from the body of the church itself and made their way into the cathedral library, which you can see here indicated, possibly up this stair turret. And they may have burnt some books in the library, or taken the books more likely and used them to light fires and their braziers inside the cathedral. So we do know a certain amount about, we can reconstruct a certain amount about what was going on in there. But it can't have been a very pleasant place to be locked up while the Council of State tried to decide what to do with these enormous numbers of prisoners. So I said that people began to fall sick, and this is a letter written by Sir Arthur Hazelrigg, who was the governor of Newcastle, commander in the north, to the Secretary of State. So he's writing to London. He was the person who was in charge of the prisoners at this time. And here we are on the 31st of October, so we are, near enough 2 months later, and we are about 6 weeks after they arrive in Durham. And he says there are about 500 sick in the castle, note in the castle, not in the cathedral, and about 600 yet in health in the cathedral. the most of which are in probability Highlanders, they being hardier than the rest, and about 1,600 are dead and buried. So this seems to tie up with the archaeological evidence that we have. Firstly, that they died mostly from dysentery, which would leave no mark on the bones, that they died in the castle, that graves are being dug hastily for them because they're dying at the rate of about 30 a day on average. They're being buried at the bottom of the garden, and it was one or two of those graves that we found back in November 2013. Hazelrig is an interesting character, and he's come into my life more than once because I've been excavating at Bishop Auckland, and there we found quite recently, well, in 2019, when we were last at the site there, and we're going back in June, we found the remains of this early 14th century chapel, which was built by Bishop Beck, which was dynamited in the 1650s by Hazelrig, who took the opportunity to acquire, in inverted commas, a number of the bishop's estates and his coal mines at the time. So I've been excavating the chapel, which he didn't. He was something of a Puritan and not a lover of bishops and the episcopate, and keen to see the end of this building. Let's just take a quick look at the survivors, because I think this is a very interesting second part of the story. We know that some men left the cathedral and were put to work by Hazelrig in labouring down coal mines. Possibly some of them went off to weave what was referred to as Scotch cloth, linen, in Newcastle. Some of them ended up in salt pans on the River Tyne. About 500 of them went down by boat from Newcastle Quay down to King's Lynn and were marched across the levels, and they got involved with drainage projects there, so substantial numbers. And this is the archaeological evidence for that. On the right here, you see the 100-foot drain, the New Bedford Cut, or the New Bedford River, which was constructed by those Dunbar Scots. An absolutely monumental engineering feat, and one which has left an extraordinary imprint, really, on the Cambridgeshire landscape. They also went further afield. There's a question mark as to whether or not they went to Ireland. I don't think they did. I don't think men were sent to Ireland. We do know, however, that 500 were sent to France, where they disappear off the historical radar. They seem to become involved in fighting between France and Spain at this time, and they're never referred to again as Dunbar men or Dunbar soldiers. It's said that some people went to Barbados. I don't think they did go to Barbados, because Barbados in 1650 was firmly held by royalists, and it wouldn't have been to the advantage of the parliamentarians to send young, willing, anti-English, anti-parliamentarian army recruits to Barbados at that time. It's also said that some went to Virginia, but for the same reasons, I don't think they went. What we do know about is those that went to New England, and this is the kind of second chapter in the story. So this is a document which is written in November of 1650. If you look at that bottom sign off there, you can see, if I read it to you, it says that letters be written to Sir Arthur Hazelrig, second line, to deliver 150 sound Scottish prisoners to Augustine Walker, master of the ship Unity, to be transported to New England. Augustine Walker was from Berwick upon Tweed, incidentally. He had houses in Boston, and he had another house on the Azores, as well as a house in Berwick. A man of the 17th century Atlantic, quite a character, and they were lucky to have him as a master. Of course, many of them had never been to sea before. There are no passenger lists for who was actually on that boat. We just know the number 150. But we do know what happened to them afterwards. So they end up being dispersed to all these places here you can see as yellow dots in and around Boston, to the west of Cape Cod, as far west as Springfield, and as far north as what is referred to in Maine as Berwick, and Dover, and ironically enough, Durham. So So these are the areas that they came to occupy. And extraordinarily enough, we found that some of these sites have been excavated. So the main site to which the Scottish prisoners were sent is Saugus Ironworks, which is just outside Boston, which is run by the American National Parks Authority. Excavated in the late 1940s and early 1950s, very early example of post-medieval historical archaeology. And the artifacts here are directly associated with the Scots. But more interesting is that we have here for the first time a list of the men, at least those who went to Saugus, and various visitors who make comments about them. And I like this one particularly. Some of the workmen be young and fond of frolicking. One or two hath done naughty works with the maidens living thereabouts. So they were young men, and they'd fought together, and now they were working together. And they were on this kind of ironworks plantation. Some of them went further north, and they ended up in the timberlands of Maine, working in sawmills for the most part. Others of them went into domestic service, and some of them appear as characters in history. One of them, for example, witnessed the signing of Harvard's charter in 1650. But they also appear in court cases, for good reason and for bad, throughout the second half of the 17th century. After their 7 years of an indenture, because these were indentured servants, they had to serve 7 years of labour, they were set free and they were given land. And remarkably, the first thing that they do is group together and they form the Scots Charitable Society in January 1657. On the day that they are released from their indenture, they start putting money into a common pot, and they use that money to help people who need help with nursing, or people who can't afford to be buried and can't afford coffins. And they continue to do that, to pay money throughout the 17th century. Now, these are people, for the most part, with absolutely nothing, and yet they are sparing what they can to contribute to their fellow Dunbar men. And this is the oldest charitable organisation currently in the world, just to give you an idea of the importance of it. And the Scots Charitable Society gave a small amount of money towards the project to enable me to do some documentary research. On release, those that ended up in the north, in Maine, they come together. So they reform a Scottish community out here on the frontier between the unknown lands of Native Americans and the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And they live side by side in farmsteads, and they give names to where they live, and they call this place Scotland. And the local parish is called Unity, which is named after the boat that they crossed the Atlantic in. And you can go out onto these sites today and look for the archaeology. This is a visit I made to Saugus, and you can see some of the 17th century pottery here that they must have used. I've been able to identify some of the burial grounds. You can see my trowel there, and in the middle of the main woodlands. And there's even the oldest surviving private house in the United States of America is the Mcintyre Garrison, which was built by a Dunbar Scot. And there it is, surviving, top left, quite extraordinary. We can track them right the way through documentation, like inventories and probates and wills of one sort or another. We can say what they had in their houses, what kind of artifacts, the names of their wives, the names of their children, whether they were rich, whether they were poor. In the case of John Burbine here, you can see his signature down here. He couldn't write, he was illiterate, so he has a little sign here, just a B and this cross. And this is him here. So I could take you now, if we could go on a bus around New England, I could take you to about 35 of the 150 graves that I've been able to identify. None of them ever came home to Scotland, for reasons which are fairly well apparent, I think. They were given land here, which they never would have had they stayed in Scotland, and they had opportunity in New England to make something of themselves. And I think when they came to die, of course, it's probably the decision of the family as to what happens to them at that point when they're old when people are old, and they had children who had been born in New England, and so there was no interest in returning to their homeland. Okay, so what happened to the Scottish soldiers? They were reburied in Durham. We can talk about that in questions if you like. This was something that was rather controversial at the time because of Indy Ref 1 and some strong feelings of nationalism at the time in and around this project, but they are there in Durham, reburied. There was a huge amount of publicity, which totally took me by surprise, and meant that for a time I had to take time away from the university just to deal with the avalanche of publicity that I was faced with. We wrote a play with the help of a well-known script writer, which was performed all the way across the Northeast, telling the story of the Scottish soldiers. It appeared a little bit on television, although surprised there wasn't more interest from TV in the story. I did something with Dan Snow, a podcast, which has had over 100,000 downloads. There have been musicians and poets who have written about this story, including the brothers Gillespie, who wrote a couple of songs and which they play to tens of thousands of people. The brothers Gillespie can reach far more people than I can by singing about Scottish soldiers at festivals. And we've been collaborating with the National Park Service in the States too. I think the biggest impact for me has been the descendants. I just didn't think it through. I never realized that if 150 people crossed the Atlantic in 1650, you end up with nearly a quarter of a million Americans today. And those families have come forward, hundreds of them. Lectures that I've given in the Boston area, 250, 270 people in every lecture, very emotional. And there are, extraordinarily, some well-known people in amongst them, or descendants of them anyway. So John Cryer, who some of you may know from 2.5 Men, which is a comedy show, is an American actor. He's a descendant. Sam Claflin, who was in things like Pirates of Caribbean, many other things, see him a lot. His family, Massachusetts, as you can imagine, but his parents came back to London, and he's British. And at the bottom, you've got Kate Upton, and her family are represented amongst the Dunbar men as well. But I think the thing, and I've met John Cryer, I did a Who Do You Think You Are program with him about this, to explain to him where his family had come from and why they'd ended up in the States. He thought that his family was Swedish, and was rather shocked to find himself on the Dunbar battlefield a few years ago making the program. He didn't have any understanding why he was spending time in Durham and Scotland until it became apparent in the course of the show. But it's been an amazing experience for me to go to the States and to meet the descendants, as I am here in this slide, and to find with them some of their burial grounds of their families, and really to consider what might happen next in terms of future projects. I've done a MOOC, which is a massive online course which you can do for free. That's attracted over 4,000 people from 104 countries, all the ones in blue here, really most of the world except for Central Africa and Greenland, and very large numbers from the States, as you can imagine. But it seems to be a story which has kind of touched those people who are descended from immigrants, those who have experienced forced immigration. And certainly it's one that's meant that I've had hundreds and hundreds of emails into my inbox, and I'm still getting them from people all over the world. We wrote a book, which I'm happy to say that is going to be made available to you for £15, which is a £10 reduction from what you would have to pay in the shops. And that's available. I'll make sure those get to you, but you can also find out something about the project through videos and YouTube and podcasts. And of course, you could sign up to the MOOC if you wanted to. It's entirely free. And I drop in from time to time and answer questions where I can. So that's all from me. I hope you've enjoyed that journey. It's been a remarkable project over the past few years, and I look forward to your questions.
Right, the first question is, were any of the Dunbar prisoners who were taken to the US involved in the East New Jersey Scottish colony?
No, if they were, they can't have been in large numbers. Those ones that I've been able to trace don't stray too far out of New England. I have one example of one unnamed Dunbar man who does end up in New Jersey, but it's unclear when he moves. For the most part, the Scots try to consolidate themselves in these communities on the edge of the Massachusetts colony, where I think they are valued in terms of their military experience and as colonizers, and frankly, as tough men out there on the edge of the world, as it would have been thought of then.
Another question, how many soldiers were buried in the mass grave that was discovered in Durham?
So we had 29 that we recovered, but there are more that we could see disappearing under the foundations of the buildings. So it's a very, very small proportion of the minimum 1,600 which are documented, who are documented to have died.
There's a comment that they say in the cathedral that Prior Castle's clock was not touched by the soldiers due to the thistle symbol. Why do you think they didn't touch it?
Well, they didn't touch it because it wasn't there. In fact, we know that Prior Castle's clock had been dismantled and put away for safekeeping before the Scots arrived and was only re-erected later. So I'm afraid that that is a myth which is peddled by blue guides and others. You can discard it, but we do know that they did burn other woodwork, possibly one of the organs, possibly some of the seating, but not the clock. They didn't want to touch the clock, according to the myth, but they couldn't touch the clock, I'm afraid.
In what form was the legend of the soldiers promulgated in Durham?
There is a single reference in the Book of Rites, which is the kind of cathedral annual of events, which mentions bodies being thrown into pits in 1650, 1651. The next references that we hear are really kind of from people within the town, so that when human remains are found, so they're attributed almost immediately to these Scots remains, but mostly we're pretty clear that the graves that have been found in the past are not those of the Scots, because they lie underneath what are Grade 1 listed buildings on the west side of Palace Cathedral Green there.
Was there any truth in the suggestion that the Scottish army were full of inexperienced soldiers because they got rid of their ungodly ones? Yes,
that's true. I think to a large, or to some extent anyway, that explains the age profile of the men that we were looking at. And that's something that was picked up particularly by the press, I might say, who really went to town on the idea of child soldiers. But that's right. I think, though, of course, you've also got this operation of selection by Cromwell on the battlefield, which takes away the very young and the very old, or even the middle-aged, and leaves you with this peculiar selection, which we were able to look at through the archaeology.
The question here is saying, was Durham the final destination intended by Cromwell, or did plans evolve during the march?
No, it was the final destination intended, because it was the largest building, which was empty and unused at that time. Services had stopped some years previously, and of course the bishop had long since fled. So there was nothing going on there. It was a large empty building. 17th century prisons, as you may know, are pretty small affairs and would only hold 20-30 people. So he was looking for a really substantial building to hold the men in, and Durham Cathedral was selected precisely for that reason.
Right. Can you explain how you actually got involved with writing the play about
Yes.
the project?
So this came about because I went to a very bad and very boring dinner run by Durham and Newcastle universities, one of these kind of formal events, and I sat next to a guy I'd never seen him before in my life, and it turned out that he was interested in taking research, mainly science research, and making it more palatable for the general public by putting on events and plays of one sort or another. And he was working on things like DNA and science and that sort of thing. And so I explained to him the story of the Scottish soldiers, and then we got together. He got some money from the Arts Council. We found ourselves with a really good script writer. We collaborated with her and with the actors during rehearsals, and we put together a play of about an hour's length, which then went out to 11 venues across the northeast, really on that Dunbar to Durham line. And we also went out to schools. I think we covered about nearly 1,000 people or something of that sort. And the intention would be to perhaps in the future think about turning that into a podcast or something that people could listen to. And certainly that's something the Americans would like very much, because they never had the opportunity to see it.
Mm. Would there be any possibility of a film even?
There would. I'm surprised actually that nobody's really picked it up in that sense, because I think the story is a very good one. I think it's a lot more interesting, frankly, than The Dig, if you've seen that. But if you haven't, you should. But it has everything really, and what it needs is, I guess, is a screenplay and some decisions about whether or not it would be more suitable as a documentary affair, or whether it would be better as something which was kind of fictionalized, something to tell the story straight, or whether it would be better to have the kind of archaeological discovery involved. I have ideas who might play me, but I'll hold those back from you.
Right, well, thank you very much for answering all those questions, and I'll now hand back to Bill.
Thank you, Pam. Chris, thank you so much for tonight's fascinating and quite humbling webinar, actually. I found it very, very thought-provoking. It's left a mark on me, and I'll be wanting to do some follow-up research. Anyway, we hope that everybody's enjoyed the webinar. As always, we do welcome your feedback, so please let us have that, good or bad. We also must thank again the Lottery Heritage Fund, whose support have helped us provide this webinar. And again, I'm going to flag up our book. Many of you will have copies of these. They're still available. They're £5 or £6.50, including post and packing. And that book and perhaps Chris's book are going to be available from details on our website, or you could call us on 01845 527 717, and we'll see what we can do about getting you a copy. Right, on to our next webinar, which is on Thursday, the 18th of February, when we have Dr. Stuart Rathmell, and Stuart's going to be talking about new approaches to understanding Viking settlements in Eastern Yorkshire. Should be fascinating, actually. Looking forward to that. Until then, please, all of you, do keep safe and well. Good night.